the notion of time. Today we are going to talk about one of the major themes of the faith, and that is the question of power, which is sort of at the center of the text. Question of power, question of authority. So how the text deals with operations of power, or how it represents operations of power. Now, if you look at the text, at the heart of it is the question of sovereign authority. Prospero, whose sovereign authority has been usurped by someone else, his brother, establishes his authority over the island. And here you have, when the shipwreck happens, there is also the sovereign power. That is the king of Naples. He is also there. So the question of sovereign authority, if we look a little bit at the text, that particular portion where Prospero sort of tells Act 1, Scene 2, where Prospero tells Miranda about their past. There, look at the language. Yes. So he's saying how he was, his throne was usurped, how he was betrayed by his brother, and how he was sort of completely, he was interested in studies, he completely busied himself with his studies, and how he sort of relegated some of his responsibilities to his brother, and how he sort of gradually he hatches a conspiracy. Hence, and this because of the delegation of some power, some authority, he says, hence his ambition growing to have no screen between this part he played and him he played it for. The part he played and him he played it for, he needs will be absolute Milan. Now, before that, he has called himself, thy father was the Duke of Milan. But here, look at the phrasing, absolute Milan. The body of the sovereign and that of the state become one and identical. Okay, so it is the question of authority, sovereign authority, is intrinsically linked to the question of the performance of sovereignty. Performance of sovereignty. So, the body, the individual body of the king, of the sovereign, and the role of the sovereign. These two are different from one another, and yet these are constantly conflated into one another, to the extent that the king starts to represent, the sovereign starts to represent the stability of the state. So, consequently, any kind of destabilization of sovereignty, it is subsequently, it is seen as a destabilization of the state power. So, the idea of the state, and this is where you have already, I think, as far as Renaissance is concerned, when we are talking about different kinds of power, different operations of power in the text, number one is the operation of sovereign power. Operations of power. Act number, sovereign power. The authority of the sovereign thwarted, and then and the same sovereign authority Prospero tries to establish on the island. However, in each case, and this is important, the sovereign power is constantly projected in a given centrality, but the sovereign power is never uncontested. In the case of Milan, this absolute conflation between the king, the body king and kingship, okay, that itself, this performance of the role of the king, when it is challenged and it is taken up by someone else, it doesn't remain uncontested. So it's contested by his brother. On the island, yes, Prospero tries to sort of establish an absolute authority, but again it is not uncontested. So the ownership, the sovereign, who does the sovereign power of the island lies with, there is constant contestation. There is a counter argument put forward by Caliban. And then very interestingly, you have the other sovereign power, that is Naples, the king of Naples. You would find somewhere in Act 2 the same kind of conspiracy that had dethroned Prospero. A similar conspiracy is being not exactly hatched, not to that extent, but at least contemplated when in Act 2, between Act 2 and Act 3, obviously the king and his courtiers are on one side of the island. Ferdinand is on the other side of the island. So they don't know that Ferdinand is alive. In fact, the king is very, very sad, he is morose, he thinks that his only son is and only heir to the throne is dead. And you have the same kind of equation that you have between Prospero and Antonio, the two brothers. One sovereign brother and one prospective sovereign, the ambitious brother. The same kind of equation exists between King of Naples, Alonso, and his brother Sebastian. And there we have a hint. When they think, there is Sebastian, there is Antonio, and a couple of others, when they think that, the heir to the throne is possibly dead, Ferdinand is possibly dead. So the heir is very important. Again, we are not only talking about the individual Ferdinand. We are not talking about the son of a father. We are talking about the heir apparent. So there is a sovereign function to be performed. And when that function is questioned, it is ultimately a crisis of kingship. And again, consequently a crisis of the state. And so there is, on the one hand, a possible crisis at this point of time they are thinking, there is this possible crisis that there is no heir apparent. But these people are also trying to take advantage of it, and Antonio is sort of proposing the similar kind of, he is making similar kinds of propositions to Sebastian, what he had done earlier. So this contested sovereignty, it runs throughout the play. It had happened 12 years earlier in Milan. It's happening on the island. It is also happening, there is also a prospect which ultimately does not take place. Now, if we look at the Renaissance political philosophy, and I'm sure you know a little bit of it by now, particularly, we keep talking about the new historicists and the cultural materialists. So basically, both were offshoots of Marxist school of historical criticism. Cultural materialists, mainly British group of scholars, and neo historicists American, but mainly more or less the same. Who, as I said, who tried to look at Renaissance texts in the broader context, broader social, cultural, and political context. Now, what they do, when we look at a Renaissance text, there has always been very strong, centrality in Renaissance political philosophy, in Renaissance social codes of behavior, of order and hierarchy is given centrality. Order and hierarchy. There is a constant thrust on order and hierarchy. Now there are lots of historians who think that these texts, Renaissance texts, they kind of reflect, they are sort of hegemonic tools. They reflect the state, the hegemony of the state. The state's, unitary vision of centralized power and order, homogeneous order. These texts reflect that. I mean, think about your Macbeth. Ultimately, it is about the rightful sovereign being restored. There is this kind of a very, very rigid framework, an order, almost a cosmic order, because the king is supposed to be a divine representation. So the king's body, there is this very famous book by Kantorowicz called The King's Two Bodies. Two bodies of the king. So there is the corporeal body of the king, and then there is the divine body. So the corporeal body is, perishable, but the divine body of the king. Think about that. That very, very common adage: the king is dead, long live the king. What does that mean? The king cannot die. The individual might, but king as in the performing, the function of the king, and the person who performs the role of the king, that position, that cannot go vacant. So in Renaissance worldview, there is a centrality to order and authority, and often there are historians who look at sort of Renaissance texts as this kind of a reflection of the state philosophy and sort of the state's discourse. But cultural materialists, particularly there is a very important book by Jonathan Dollimore called Political Shakespeare, which is it's edited, not by Jonathan Dollimore, edited by Jonathan Dollimore. Okay, and there is a very important. We will refer to that essay, and I'll share that essay with you. There is a very important essay on Tempest, but that basically deals with colonialism. So I'm right now not taking that up. But if you look at the introduction given by Jonathan Dollimore, Dollimore very clearly says, or he argues, that Renaissance texts, they are not mere vehicles of state propaganda. They are not there is no one-to-one correlation between the structures of power and expression of culture. But at the same time, culture has very, very complex relationship with power. That is undeniable. But it is not the Renaissance texts. They do not simply express the philosophy of the state. There are other things, there are other components, there are other ideological elements, and the text always is a contested field. Dollimore quotes another historian called Lawrence Stone. I'm not going into that, but the main point is late 16th and early 17th century. These were marked by sort of a hysterical demand for order, as I was telling you, in society, in politics. So, there's this very strange sort of parallel between the Copernican cosmic order and the Renaissance social order. So, by this time, from the Ptolemaic world, we have sort of gradually, again, it is contested. The church is obviously against it, but slowly already have the notion, from what we call a Ptolemaic cosmic order to a Copernican cosmic order. Okay, in sort of from a geocentric order to a cosmic order to a heliocentric cosmic order. That is an order where the sun is at the center and there's planetary movements around the sun. So the same kind of structure was imagined in terms of the political and social order where the king, the sovereign is at the center, the sun, and there are ranks, there are others around him. And this is sort of a centripetal, there is constant movement towards the center. It is the center that very closely holds everything together. So it is the center which is it is the axis which keeps the entire order still. So throughout late 16th, early 17th century, it's there. And there is through Renaissance literature, Renaissance, sort of culture of the Renaissance court, Renaissance philosophy, there is constant legitimation and validation of the status quo, stability, constantly. But where Dollimore sort of, it's there. But Dollimore says that, it is not a single political vision. It is not this overarching control of the state. Dollimore says we should not look at it as the unchallenged authority and power of the state. Rather, it is state's response to a very, very drastically and radically changing world outside. The idea is, what Jonathan Dollimore is arguing is that this overarching power of the state controlling everything from the center, Dollimore says it might come across as if this is the unchallenged power of the state. State এত powerful যে সবকিছু control করছে। কিন্তু in reality এই যে excessive control, this is actually the state's sort of knee-jerk reaction to a world that is radically changing. একটা এমন পৃথিবী যেটা খুব দ্রুত, খুব তাড়াতাড়ি বদলাচ্ছে। এবার এটা সব জায়গায় কখন একটা স্টেট অথরিটেরিয়ান হয়, আরো বেশি বড় অথরিটি, you try to assert your power even more when you know that there are too many changes around you, too many changes which are beyond your control. So you want to control them even more. So Dollimore says that this centrality of order in the Renaissance discourse, in Renaissance literature, in Renaissance philosophy, instead of looking at it as unchallenged power of the state, we should look at it as state's response to other, to radical changes in society, to other forces. And those forces are very much there. What kind of changes are we looking at? First of all, that entire medieval world order is breaking down. Okay, so the medieval notion of kingship, the medieval sort of the feudal order, it is kind of going through, we are now talking about the early modern period, it is kind of going through a phase of transformation. Sort of a new merchant class is on the rise. Their profession, so the merchant class, the professional class, the new kind of economic activities, all of these things are reshaping the class structure and class relations. Particularly the gentry, what was understood as the gentry. The shape, size, composition of that gentry is going through change. Number two, the other very important factor is that there is if you look at the medieval world, there are two figures of authority. One is the king, the other is the church. Both are now, we are talking about early 17th century, post-Reformation, both have gone through very, very significant challenges. Okay, so for people of the Renaissance, challenges to authority is not unseen. In fact, it is something many of them have seen in their own lifetime. So it is in the face of those kind of challenges that we see there is a renewed effort on the part of the state to legitimize its power. And so you have this constant emphasis on authority, on sovereignty, but again, and this is what Dollimer says in Political Shakespeare, that Shakespeare keeps his space, the literary space, the space of theatre, a contested field by allowing all these other ideological components, allowing space there. Theatre, something that we had already discussed in the last class, it was very, very powerful. Public theatre. So the state was also well aware of the hegemonic power of theatre, but also the subversive power of theatre. So theatre was used or could be used to propagate the hegemony of the state, propagate the philosophy of the state, but the state was also well aware that theatre it could project power, it could represent power, but it could also demystify power to the extent that it can subvert power. So this potential, this subversive potential of theatre remained, more or less with all Renaissance playwrights, and here we are talking about Shakespeare. Also remember, The Tempest was when it was written, the Jacobean England, it was already a period of transformation. After the prolonged and sort of stable sovereign rule of Elizabeth, it went through a crisis of state crisis of lineage. Who's going to inherit the throne? And after that, as I said, the two institutions of authority, the church, the Catholic Church was already contested, and the king was already facing contestation from a gradually, empowered parliament. So from the time of Henry VIII, parliament was slowly and surely, and these two are interconnected. The rise, the Reformation, this kind of a challenge to the authority. Remember, when we are talking about challenge to the Catholic Church, we are also talking about challenge to the political authority, not just the religious authority, but political authority of the Pope. And by now the entire Christendom is kind of divided between Catholics and Protestants. And if you look at it very carefully, Protestantism gained ground in sort of those countries which were also opening up. These were primarily mercantile countries. England, Netherlands. Okay, these countries gradually, though it started, obviously Lutheranism started in Germany, in various city-states of Germany, and it had considerable support of these mercantile, the state and the mercantile community. So it did have, because these are the states that they also wanted to challenge, they also wanted to regain sovereign power. They wanted to establish their sovereign power, complete sovereign power, as opposed to the, sharing it with the Pope and the Catholic Church. But so in England, from the time of Henry VIII, we know gradually Parliament started gaining power. By the time we come to the King James's time, and when this was the Tempest was being composed, there is the relation between the king and the Parliament is already confrontational. Particularly, the Parliament was not at all happy with the fiscal policy of James. It was being challenged. The financial rights of the king they were being argued as he was thought to be very financially very irresponsible as a king, over expenditure of royalty. All those questions was Shakespeare was living at a time, and this play was being written at a time when the divine power of kingship and the authority, sovereign authority of the king was already challenged. Okay, so the challenges to authority, sovereignty as a contested field, what we see in the text, it has serious real life reverberation in society. Just a few years back, Tempest, as you know, was written around maybe 1610. Between 1608 and 1611, there was a crisis of kingship in Bohemia, not in England, in Bohemia. King Rudolf II of Bohemia, he lost control of Austria. Austria, Hungary, Moravia, Bohemia, all this is complete his empire. He lost control as he was dethroned by his brother. So it's a very, very clear, immediate, and what happened in Bohemia, it sort of happened because there were other kings, other rulers in other European states, so it obviously it created ripple across Europe. So there was an immediate historical, contemporary reference point of loss of sovereignty, challenges to sovereignty, which might have had direct impact on the play. But this question, these contestations regarding sovereignty, even recurs in Shakespeare. An obvious reference is Macbeth. But another, closer parallel is Hamlet. Because in Hamlet also, the same thing happened. The rightful king who was killed. Actually, it's a conspiracy, and again, it's the brother that killed him. So this kind of runs through the Shakespearean canon. Now, when we are talking about this kind of the theatrical text as a contested field, we can also take recourse to Raymond Williams, the Marxist historian. Raymond Williams' famous book, Marxism and Literature, where Williams says that at any given point of time, literature, in cultural forms, there are three kinds of cultural forms that exist within the field of culture. And he named these three: residual, dominant, and emerging. Residual, dominant, and emerging. What does he mean? He is saying that, look, he is looking at this entire history from a class perspective. And he says, look, when we are talking about, historical materialism, when we are talking about historical changes in class composition, that does not happen on one day. Forget about class. When we are talking about, you go back to the history of English literature. When we are talking about Old English and Middle English, a question is regularly posed: when does the Middle English period start? And you say 1066. What does it even mean? Is it so that one fine morning of 1066, the world changes? So yes, we kind of specific historical events, we give, we take them as yardsticks, change. But society changes over a period of time. It's a slow process, and there's a long period of transition. So Williams says that, in society at any given point of time, you have elements, in any given society, you have elements, components from a past society, continued in as far as culture is concerned, in the contemporary culture of a particular age. You have, on the one hand, residues certain remnants, continuation of cultural elements of a previous social order. That's what he calls residual. Then you have dominant. That is, any sort of class society, you have a particular group, a particular social group, a particular social class gaining economic power along with that political power. So it gains dominance. It starts to dominate the discourse. The moment it gains economic power, it wants political power, and then it wants to continue that political power, that hold on society, and culture is the best way to do it. So that is the dominant discourse, dominant culture of a particular society. And then there is emerging. So the dominant discourse, the dominant power in no society is completely unchallenged. There are already elements in society which is trying to counteract, which is trying to challenge. Maybe those are social groups which will eventually come into power. So, for example, if you look at the Renaissance, it already have the dominant social group is still the aristocracy. Okay, the king, and which is why you have the dominant state discourse of the centrality of the king, something that we have been talking about, and the kind of order it wants to establish, it wants to continue. You have residues from the medieval times. You have residual sort of elements, cultural elements continue. But you already have an emerging class. You have the commercial class, you have the merchant class, and already there are, so the dominant discourse of state centrality and sovereign centrality is there, but you already have in the fact that the cultural texts, they are making way, they are making space for counter discourses, for emerging discourses. Okay, so in the same way that the king's sovereignty is being contested by the parliament, new kind of, a very different kind of social order slowly but surely is coming, where the traditional class structures are about to change, on the verge of change. Those changes are already indicated in the literary text, in the cultural field of culture. Okay. Now, another thing, so when we are talking about the state, the sovereign state, there are two absolutely central images of the text. One is obviously the island. And the island becomes, as I said, the space to put, bring together all these different social relations. Where sovereignty, the idea of sovereignty, the idea of authority can be discussed and challenged and counteracted. Right? So you have, a master, you have king, you have kingship, you have other forms of authority. We'll come to that in a moment. But there is the island, obviously. The other central symbol is that of the ship. And the ship, when we see the ship for the first time, it is a ship out of control. And throughout Renaissance literature, often we come across, this kind of parallel. The ship has a metaphor for the state. So in the same way that a state needs to be controlled and steered in the right direction by the sovereign, so does the ship. So a ship out of control, sort of it metaphorically represents a state out of control. Challenge, contestation of sovereign power. There is this very famous ode by Horace. Now Horace's odes are usually just numbered. But this particular ode, when it was translated, this is about, there is a central image of the ship, and he is asking the ship to come back to the harbor because it has gone through, this terrible storm near the coast of Africa, etc. So the original ode was just numbered. But as you know, Renaissance is also the time when the classical texts, Latin texts, are extensively translated. So most of the English translators translated this ode and gave it the title To the Ship of State.
Sorry. Tomorrow, আমাদের PhD admission test আছে। ক্লাস হওয়ার পসিবিলিটি খুব কম। 11:30 তে আমি লাইব্রেরিয়ানকে বলেছি 11:30 তে লাইব্রেরিতে ক্লাস হবে 11:30 to 1:30। এই মানসিক প্রিপারেশন নিয়ে আসবে, তারপর যদি ইফ পসিবল এখানে ক্লাস করানো আমরা ক্লাস করব। যদি কোনো মাস্টারমশাই 9:30 তে ক্লাস নিতে চান সেটা হতে পারে, কিন্তু 11টা থেকে 1:30 পর্যন্ত কোনো চান্স নেই। ওই টাইমটা বেস্ট ইউজের জন্য লাইব্রেরিতে তোমরা যাচ্ছ, আমিও যাবো, অ্যাটেন্ডেন্স দেবো, আগের দিন অ্যাটেন্ডেন্সটা দিয়ে দেবো, ঠিক আছে? এইটা তোমরা কমিউনিকেট করো সবার সঙ্গে, হোল ডিপার্টমেন্ট। এখন আর কেউ নেই কোনো ডিপার্টমেন্ট, কোনো ইয়ারে ক্লাস স্টুডেন্টস নেই, কিন্তু যাদের সঙ্গে দেখা হবে তোমরা বলে দেবে। ওকে, থ্যাংক ইউ।
So the play directs us, this sort of the ship in the turmoil, it kind of again projects this idea of sovereignty, the state, in turmoil. Ultimately, by the end of the, and this is again something that happens everywhere, that happens in Macbeth, that happens everywhere. At the end, there is some kind of a restoration. There is sort of renegotiation of the, players of power, and there is restoration of order. But in the meantime, the areas of contestation and limits of power are exposed. Right? If you have read the play, you'll see again a portion which is clear parallel with Macbeth. This is Act 4, that mask. Before that mask, there is a banquet. Prospero calls the others at a banquet, and it is at this banquet, the banquet is disrupted, because it is in that banquet that through Ariel, through his spirits, Prospero questions and tries to expose the usurpers, his own brother as well as the potential usurper, that is Sebastian. So, think about the interrupted banquet of Macbeth. Remember the banquet scene. Every time Macbeth tries to sit at the head of the table, it is disrupted. Because Macbeth is not the lawful sovereign. So the banquet, in a way, first of all, it is a collective feast. It is an affirmation of social relations and social order, social hierarchy. So a formal banquet, in a formal banquet, everyone's place is predetermined. Even today, you go to a formal banquet, কে কোথায় বসবে একেবারে, and this is according to order, according to station, and this kind of banquet, particularly the kind of banquet, let's say Macbeth called, it was his attempt to establish himself as the new king. The first banquet called by the new king. So he sits, it is the king who is the host, is supposed to stay at the head of the table, just like he is the head of the state. And then everybody, if you remember the banquet scene, when he comes, Macbeth, and sits at the head of the table, and then everybody stands up, nobody can sit before the king sits, and then say, all of you know your place, sit down. So everyone's place, according to who is what is, according to their title, according to their social status, and everybody sits there. The only one who doesn't find a rightful place is, ironically, Macbeth. Because obviously, as I said, for the, Renaissance political vision, the order is very, very important. There is, as Dollimore says, almost a hysterical thrust a constant attempt to establish order through various textual means. But so every time Macbeth wants to sit, and then it's interrupted by the ghost of the past. Okay. Here again, that is a tragedy. Obviously, here the same. I mean, here again there is a banquet, but here also the banquet is interrupted. In the case of Macbeth, the interruption is supernatural, the ghost of banquet. Here also, the interruption is supernatural, Ariel and the spirits. And it is sort of the, people who engage in the banquet, people who become part of the banquet, they are reminded of what they have done. So, the banquet as an attempt, as a reflection of sovereign order, but a banquet also becomes a means to show the limits of the sovereign order, the contestations associated with the sovereign order, sovereign power. So sovereign power is one kind of, when we are talking about operations of power, there is the sovereign power. Number two is the power of knowledge. In Prospero's body, there are two kinds of authorities that come together. The sovereign authority and the authority of knowledge, authority of books. Prospero, again and again, there is emphasis on Prospero's relation with books. Remember Caliban, when he hatches a conspiracy with Trinculo and Stefano, he says that, I know the monster, he sleeps there, so you go in his cell, he'll be all alone. He says, the first thing you should do, you should take away his books. That is the source of his magic. First you take away his books and then you kill him. So Prospero's authority to a large extent is derived from books. Okay. And in the same way that the play talks about, or Renaissance text overall talks about the limits of sovereign power, they also, on the one hand, there is this constant foregrounding of knowledge, and the knowledge gained by individual knowledge as the source of, as something that shapes, as the means of self-fashioning. I'm sure you have been told this term, Renaissance self-fashioning. Again, neo historicist Stephen Greenblatt has a famous book called Renaissance self-fashioning. So the word fashion, it comes into fashion around the same time, and the idea of self-fashioning. So the self, not as something pre-given, predetermined, but as something that can be transformed, that can be changed, that can be shaped. Subjective pursuit of selfhood. And this is when, in the previous point, when I was talking about the fact that, sovereign power trying to establish itself in an ever-changing world. And I said that the medieval worldview changes drastically. One of the major changes was this. So, the medieval, till the medieval age, now, when we are talking about the medieval age, it's a very limited idea. Let us be, when we are talking about the Renaissance, for example, we forget that even before the 16th century, there were periods of, in Europe, with the so-called Middle Ages. Even during that, there were periods of, cultural and creative sort of outpouring of creative energy and cultural output. So nowadays we also talk about the 12th century Renaissance, Charlemagne, that period. So, and Renaissance is not constant, so there were phases. But give or take, when we are talking about the medieval worldview, we are talking about a worldview in which everything is predetermined. Right? Your positions, yourself. It was so the entire idea of the original sin and the idea that this life is sinful. So you are, whatever you have in your life, the kind of life you have, the kind of social status you have, the kind of person you are, it is determined, it is divine wish. So any attempt to change it would be sacrilege. Any attempt to change it would amount to going against the wish of God, the will of God. Now, by the time we come to the Renaissance, that particular point of view has changed. It does not mean, mind you, Renaissance humanism is not exactly antithetical to the idea of divinity. Not at all. It is not. Most of the, Renaissance humanists, many of them were actually scholasticians, religious scholars. But the idea is Renaissance humanism, particularly, Neoplatonists and all, they look at human life, yes, divinely ordered, but they would counter argue that if you have intellect, if human beings have the potential to think and to change, then that potential is in us because of the divine will. Now, if you do not use that, then you are going against the divine will. So there is an attempt to combine this idea of divinity with the idea of individual pursuit. Right? And we have to understand why. We are talking about the early modern period. We are talking about a radical social economic change. A new class is coming up. This entire idea of a predestined, predetermined order, it suited the medieval feudal hierarchy, where everything was associated with land, and land was associated, it was titular from one generation to another. Now you have an emerging class, a merchant class, a commercial class, which is sort of trying to make it something out of their life. So the emerging class, also they will be gradually, by the time we'll come to 18th, 19th century, we are right now in the early phase of capitalism. By that time, we'll have 18th century proper mercantile capitalism, and this particular class, which is right now the emerging class, the dominant class is still the aristocracy, which is why it is the aristocracy, we see them everywhere in every play, which is why the king and surrounding him all the courtiers. But there is already an emerging class putting forward counter discourse. That emerging class will become the dominant class within a century or two. Right? So, knowledge, for Renaissance, it's important to shape the subjective pursuit of the self. The self becomes very important, and it can be shaped, it can be fashioned. In fact, the entire idea of Neoplatonism is that it can be fashioned as far as there is a divine model, the ideal. And there are different stages of the being. So, the entire Petrarchan journey of the self through the sonnets, this is gradually an attempt at self, the self trying to attain that ideal state. There is no collapse, and you can never become one with the ideal. But there is always an anticipation, and in the process, there is a process of transformation through which you go in pursuit of that ideal. And knowledge is an important tool for Renaissance self-fashion. And look at the kind of knowledge. Here, the kind of knowledge we are talking about, again, a very different kind of knowledge than the medieval idea knowledge. This is not religious knowledge. This is not scholastic knowledge. This is a form of knowledge which again challenges the limits of knowledge. It is called magical. Look at Prospero. In a way, it is a new kind of knowledge. He may come across as a technocrat or as a scientist. In fact, there are adaptations of the Tempest where Prospero is imagined as sort of this mad scientist, right? Who kind of conjures up all these things out of nothing. So clearly we are living in a time of new knowledges opening up. So the idea of knowledge from this is new forms of knowledge challenging the established limits of knowledge. We already have had that. Remember your Dr. Foster's 1590s, where again the limits of knowledge, challenging the limits of knowledge and sort of moving towards an idea of dark knowledge, a knowledge which is forbidden. Okay, so here Prospero also kind of moves towards that idea of forbidden knowledge, but this is a kind of this knowledge is given some sort of legitimacy, because now we are living at a time when we have all these kind of new knowledges which are, these are happening in real life, but which, this is still a field of the unknown. It is not clearly defined. We do not know whether it's completely, they did not know at that point of time, whether it's completely good or bad. Not everything could be explained, so it's magical. It is magical and it's transformative. Okay, so the book as the source of knowledge. Again, it has also cultural reinforcement of this idea of the book as the source of knowledge through Reformation. Because Reformation also, unlike a more ritualistic performance of religion, it is Reformation in Protestantism, post-Luther, which talks about the importance of the book. Go back to the book as the sole authority. So, we are also, why so much importance given to book? Because we are entering a book culture, a book market. So, a major shift from the medieval age to the early modern age is in the change of reading culture. So, in the medieval age, you had handwritten manuscripts. Most of the people could not, and most of them were in Latin, a language which was not accessible to common people. So in the medieval age, you had this reading, collective reading cultures, oral culture. Very few manuscripts, and maybe someone would read out or perform, orally transmit, and people would gather and they would listen. So there was a culture of collective reading. By the early modern age, particularly post-Gutenberg, we have in place what Benedict Anderson calls print capitalism. A print culture, so we are in the phase of early capitalism, but when he's talking about print capitalism, the importance of printed material, of the printing press in the dissemination of knowledge. So it is the printing press that has had a defining role in deciding what is knowledge and what is not, and what are the new forms of knowledge. Because you can no longer rely on the earlier, you have a dissemination of knowledge, the number of printed material you have, and the kind of reach it can have. It is unprecedented. So that book market, this newly emerging print capitalism and book market, makes the book, so from a culture of reading, which was oral and collective, you have now a culture of reading which is textual, which constantly refers to the written word, the book, the text, and a more individualistic pursuit of knowledge. So you can have a one-to-one correspondence with your text. So the centrality of the book, we often, again and again, you go back to the text, how many times you'll find, again and again, we see Prospero with the text. So you have the power of knowledge, you have the power of sovereign power. Number 3 is the power of language, discursive power. It is interesting to know that both the word author and authority, they have the same root. Etymologically, they can be traced back to the same root. Both basically came from the Latin word augere. it originally meant, and it's very interesting, to increase, to originate, to promote. So from there comes the Latin word octave. And then via, again it means, octave very interestingly means promoter, producer, father. And then in 12th century through Old French this word comes in medieval English, and gradually from the late 14th century it starts to be associated. So you have author as the original composer. That didn't happen earlier. That only in the late 14th century around. Author being associated with the original composer as opposed to other forms of writers. A copyist, a translator, right? A compiler as opposed to the author. And gradually you have the author as the signatory and the centrality. So in the same way that the sovereign is at the center of the state, the social order, the textual order is around the author. So the figure of authority, Prospero, is the figure of authority, both sovereign authority and he is also the authorial figure. So the literary space, as I told you the last day, the entire story in a way is completely conjured and singularly controlled by Prospero. So Prospero, we can almost, Prospero is almost an authorial figure in that sense of the term. The figure of the author as the composer, as the originator. Okay, everything originates in him and has complete, it is his meaning, it is his voice. And he draws that power from his power of language. Think about that part when, he talks to Miranda and he tells Miranda about their past. This is a clear exercise in rhetoric. Okay, I'll stop here. I think tomader class. I don't want to. Class. So I don't want to eat up. I mean, just exercise in rhetoric. We'll discuss in the next class. But I think Thursday I'll meet you for Amit. Oh, Carl. We missed that class. ঠিক আছে দেখা যায় কালকে 9:30 খালি তোমরা ঠিক আছে ঠিক আছে কারণ কি কালকে আমাদের ছিল 18th century I haven't even started যাই হোক দেখা যায় এক্সট্রা ক্লাস পাওয়া যায় তো আমি জাস্ট এইটা বলে দিই আমি এগুলো নিয়ে আমরা আলোচনা পরে দিন করব সো পাওয়ার অফ ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ পাওয়ার অফ ডিসকোর্স author শব্দটাকে যদি দেখো the transformation of the word author another meaning that emerges is that of the father. So another exercise of power is the paternal power, the authority of the father and the challenges to it. Which obviously brings us to the question of gender. And then obviously the power of theatre.